moving on to the next, I would like to call it a monologue almost, a soliloquy, is to talk about something very close to my heart. As a performing artist, I have always been fascinated by, pre-independent India, the revolutionaries, the movements, the bloodshed, the sacrifices. But I guess, the drama lies elsewhere. There's so many things that are still being dug out, are still being unearthed, being discovered, and that's exactly what we do at Arth, a culture fest. We rediscover, we revisit, we realign, we re-explore, we rediscover ourselves. That's what is going to happen in the next forum, how the revolutionary movement and British responses still define Bharatvarsh, India. And taking us forward to this would be Sanjeev Sanyal, who's an internationally acclaimed economist and best-selling author and is currently closely associated with the government of India as a principal economic advisor. He's well acquainted with the nooks and crannies of the financial sector, as he was a global strategist and managing director at Deutsche Bank till 2015. Interesting, Sanjeev Sanyal. Welcome on stage, Sanjeev Sanyal. Ladies and gentlemen, Sanjeev will take us through how the revolutionary movement and the British responses still define Bharatvarsh.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak about a topic that is very close to my heart, which is that of the revolutionary movement. And as you can see from the slide, it's about the other history of India's freedom movement. Now, why am I going to tell you about this? Because much of the textbook history that many of you read excludes the role the revolutionary movement played in India's freedom struggle. Of course, much of this is very recent. Some of it is even in living memory. So it's not the case that people do not know the names of some of these characters like Bhagat Singh or Chandrasekhar Azad or Bismil or Raj Bihari Bose. But you get the impression that whatever they did were basically individual acts of bravery. You don't get the impression that, in fact, this is a movement that was sustained over a half a century, and that it had enormous impact, not just on what they were trying to achieve, but also on other streams of the freedom movement, including the non-violent movement. So today, if you read the textbooks, you get the impression that, our freedom movement was somehow uniquely non-violent, that we gently suggested to the British that they should leave, and they politely left. That is totally not the case. India did have an armed movement. It was sustained by some very remarkable people over decades. They knew each other, and they had many linkages, which I'm going to talk about. And they kept coming back to some themes that I will also talk about. Finally, I'm going to give you a sense of how many of the things that the revolutionary did impacted India, not just then, but continues to impact India subsequently. So let's go back to the beginning. Now, of course, armed resistance to the British was there right from the beginning when they tried to colonize India. So there were, of course, the efforts by the likes of the Marathas to push back against the British. There was the Great Revolt of 1857, hugely inspiring to the revolutionaries later on. But I'm not talking about that part of the armed resistance to British rule. I'm talking about a much more later movement, a distinct movement, which was a modern movement in many ways. So when you talk about the older armed resistance to British rule, basically that was by the traditional social structures that were there in India. And of course, the revolt of 1857 was the last big effort by that group. But there were subsequent revolts as well, as happened in Jharkhand by Birsa Munda or in Manipur and so on. But really speaking, the movement I'm going to talk about, which is the revolutionary movement, is a thoroughly modern movement inspired in many ways by the nationalist movements happening in the rest of the world at that time. And the first act, which can be called a part of this revolutionary effort, happened in 1897. It happened in Pune by the Sapekar brothers, who assassinated a plague inspector who happened to be carrying out quite draconian measures in Pune at that time. And they carried out this assassination on Ganesh Khind Road. The road still exists today, but it doesn't look like what it did then. As you can see, it was a tree-covered avenue. It is today a very heavy thoroughfare. And of course, as a result of which they were betrayed by some of their relatives, in fact, and they ended up getting hanged. But this was a major event because it sparks, in a sense, this new movement that came about. And there is a small memorial to them today on Ganesh Khind Road. Many of you from Pune may not be aware of this, but it's a very small memorial across from a popular mall. And you can go and see it. I've got a photograph there of it. Now, why was this new movement starting? It was happening because Indians were becoming more and more politically aware. Now, the Indian National Congress had now existed for a few years. But in the initial years, the Indian National Congress was basically a debating society run by people who we can basically call loyalists. I mean, they would make almost pitiable petitions to the British, and occasionally the British would deign to accept their petitions. So it's about at the turn of the century, three new leaders emerged. They were Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Pal, and Lala Lajpat Rai, the Lal-Bal-Pal trio, who basically began to ask serious questions of the British. Now, you may know them from your textbooks as the extremists, as opposed to the mainstream Congress leaders who are called the moderates. It tells you a lot about who wrote the history subsequently, that those who were asking for freedom were called the extremists as if they were asking for something quite extreme, and those who were making these pitiable petitions are known as moderates, as if that was the reasonable thing to do. If we had other people writing the history, or if the Lal-Bal-Pal and their supporters had written history, very likely you would have today remembered this as the tussle between the nationalists on one hand and the loyalists. But anyway, as a result of this awakening that happened, you began to see the first generation of thinkers, leaders, you may call them, who began to pop up in the first decade of the 20th century. And this began to take shape, particularly in Bengal, with the setting up in 1902 of the Anushilan Samiti. The Anushilan Samiti really was an akhada, a traditional gymnasium, and it was set up in Kolkata in Ishwar Thakur Lane. That akhada or club still exists, as it happens to be. And if you visit it, you can see there's a narrow entrance to it. And there's badminton is widely played, and not many people would realize that this is where the revolutionary movement really got going, except for a map of undivided India on the back wall. That's the only real memory of what happened here. And this Anushilan Samiti then began to spread as a network of revolutionary akhadas across Bengal and then more widely across the Gangetic Plains. Very quickly, the leader of that became a gentleman we now know as Sri Aurobindo, who is remembered today as a spiritual leader, but in fact is one of the fathers of our freedom movement, Aurobindo Ghosh. So he and his brother Barin Ghosh began to organize these akhadas and began to provide them an ideological basis through a bunch of writings in newspapers, which were called Bande Mataram and Jugantar. Interestingly, at this point in time, Aurobindo Ghosh actually lived in Baroda, and he was the vice principal of Baroda College. And Maharaj Sayaji Gaikwad, the ruler of Baroda, was one of his supporters, and he was very well aware of what Aurobindo was doing and was providing fair amount of support. Just as a reminder that many of the princely states secretly supported this movement, very often forgotten today. What they did was that in the early part of the 20th century, the first decade, during the Swaraj, the movement around the division of Bengal in 1905, they began to expand very, very rapidly, and they built a bomb factory just north of Kolkata in a place called Maniktola. Now, Maniktola is today inside Kolkata, but then it was a suburb, and there was a garden house there, Baganbadi, where Baring Ghosh began to gather young men to discuss politics and to receive arms training. And they, in fact, did carry out a few attacks, but they got caught very quickly, and they were arrested in what came to be known as the Alipur bomb case, and many of them ended up being sent off to Kalapani. Aurobindo Ghosh was himself captured. He was released briefly, and the idea was to recapture him, but he escaped to Pondicherry, and then he would spend the rest of his life in Pondicherry. But this was the real beginning of that movement. At about the same time, you had in London another remarkable character called Veer Savarkar. Veer Savarkar also had been inspired by Tilak. He had been based in the Nasik, Pune area, where he had formed another group of revolutionaries called Abhinav Bharat, which means literally Young India. And he then went off to London to study, where there was you can call it a hostel, which had been set up by Shyamji Krishna Varma, a wealthy entrepreneur with nationalist leanings. And he had gathered a group of remarkable young men, including Savarkar, who he very well knew had these very strongly revolutionary views. And they began to create a network not just in the UK, but also across Europe, particularly in Paris. So in London, in London House, you had Savarkar, of course, but he had around him others like Madan Lal Dhingra, VVS Iyer, and then he had followers in Oxford like Lala Hardayal, who was at St. John's College, incidentally my college in Oxford. And they began to basically write all these incendiary literature. Now, while Savarkar was there, he also wrote a book which rethought, in a sense, re-represented the 1857 revolt, which was then considered a mutiny, and he used information from the British sources themselves to make the case that it was, in fact, the first war of independence. Now, you can imagine this wasn't very popular with the authorities, and the book was banned and so on. But what it did do, and this is very important for the revolutionary movement later on, is that it established in the heads of the revolutionary movement a key strategy, which was that the key to throwing the British out of India was to cause a revolt in the Indian armed forces and to undermine the loyalty of these forces to the British Crown. So as you will see, much of what they did subsequently is driven by this thinking, and it was contributed by Savarkar. Now, in 1909, one of Savarkar's followers, Madan Lal Dhingra, assassinated Curzon Wiley, who was a senior official in the British government, particularly related to issues connected to India. He was also head of the intelligence gathering about Indian students in London. And Madan Lal Dhingra, who was also a young student, assassinated him in a building that we know as today as Imperial College, but that ground at that point in time was occupied by the Imperial Institute. The original building no longer exists except for this tower that I have shown you. I visited it a couple of years ago, and left a flower in memory of Madan Lal Dhingra, who was captured subsequently and was then hanged in Pentonville prison. But he would become a major inspiration for another great revolutionary, Udham Singh, a generation later. You have the photograph of Madan Lal Dhingra on top and that of VVS Iyer on below. Dhingra's ashes would be brought back to India in 1976. So many, many decades later, his ashes would be brought back to India. So they are now in India. But meanwhile, of course, the British authorities began to keep very close watch on Savarkar. And he turned up at an event which loyalist Indians in London had organized in support of the British. And he stood on a chair there and gave a long defense of what Madan Lal Dhingra had done, for which he was beaten up and thrown out of the building of the meeting. So very quickly, Savarkar realized what was going to happen. He escaped to Paris, where he had another network, where there was a network already there, led by Sardar Singh Rana and Bhikaji Kama. So you know these names now, partly because particularly Bhikaji Kama is a name today remembered largely because of a location in Delhi that's named after a Bhikaji Kama place. But she was in Paris and was a key supporter of the revolutionaries and of Savarkar particularly. When I went to Paris, you can see me standing in front of Sardar Singh Rana's house. It still exists. The location of Bhikaji Kama's house does not exist in its the location is still there, but the house has obviously been replaced by a modern house. Unfortunately, Savarkar felt very uncomfortable having escaped to Paris, where he was safe, but he felt that he had let down his his friends who were still in London. So he went back to London. It turned out to be a bad decision because he was immediately captured. He was then put on trial, and of course, he was then accused of having provided pistols for carrying out various assassinations and other things in the British Empire. And he was shipped back to India to face trial. But on the way in Marseille, he jumped out of the ship and swam to the shore and would have escaped, but for the fact that Bhikaji Kama and VVS Iyer, who was coming to sort of pick him up in a car, turned up 5 minutes late. And he was recaptured, and the local policeman handed him back to the British. So he ended up back in the ship that was brought to India, and he too ended up in the Andamans cellular jail, better known as Kalapani. Now, meanwhile, while all of this was going on in London, back in India, the Anushilan network had obviously gone through a major shock, as you can imagine, because of the arrests of Barin Ghosh and his group, who had then been shipped off to Kalapani or hanged, as may have been the case. So the network was now taken up by a remarkable young disciple of Aurobindo called Rash Bihari Bose. And he began to operate in northern India, building up networks in Punjab, in the Gangetic Plains. Of course, he had links to Bengal, to Chandanagar in particular. And he began to build a new network. And in 1912, in Chandni Chowk, he carried out a big attack against Lord Hardinge, the Viceroy of India at that time, who was coming in this ceremonial parade, who was going through Chandni Chowk as a part of the shift of the capital at that time from Kolkata to Delhi. And as his elephant walked through this Chandni Chowk, they passed Katra Dhulia, which is a wholesale cloth market. And from the first floor, he and Basant Biswas threw a bomb on Lord Hardinge. It narrowly missed Lord Hardinge, but exploded and killed his mahout, but also injured Lord Hardinge enough that he had to be hospitalized for several months. After this incident, all the those who had sort of planned this incident escaped Delhi. Vasanta Biswas made his way to Lahore and then ultimately back to Bengal. He was captured later, sadly, and hung. But Raj Bihari went back to Dehradun, where he worked as a research laboratory assistant in the Forestry Research Institute in Dehradun. And once he went back to there, he pretended that he was very shocked by this attack on the Viceroy, and he in fact organized an event to condemn this incident. So, and it was such the fine act that when several months later, when Lord Hardinge came to Dehradun, Raj Bihari Bose was made the leader of the Indian group that received Lord Hardinge to the Forestry Research Institute. Now, I've got a photograph here of the Forestry Research Institute as it stood at that time. Of course, the grand buildings you see of the Forestry Research Institute are of a decade later. So, these buildings still belong to the Forestry Research Institute, and if you go to Dehradun, and you'll see the semi-abandoned building at the back in red, that is where Raj Bihari used to work at that time. It's just behind what is now the Tibet Bazaar. Now, meanwhile, the group of revolutionaries that Savarkar had left behind in North America, in northern Europe, began to organize themselves in various ways. But clearly, the British were always behind them. So one of them, Lala Hardayal, escaped to North America, and he made his way to California, where he based himself in San Francisco. In fact, he gathered around himself a group of students at Berkeley. And then he began to make links with a large Punjabi, particularly Sikh community that had come to settle on the west coast of both the US and of Canada. So the entire California to British Columbia coastline had a large number of Punjabis who were going and settling them, and some of them were taking to farming, but many of them were in the logging industry. And there were sizable numbers of them, and Lala Hardayal began to organize them and radicalize them with ideas of nationalism and revolution and so on. And he created a paper which was published in Urdu, Punjabi, Hindi, and so on, called the Gadar. And so this became known as the Gadar movement. And they had the local Indian community gathered together money and even gave him a house. You can see a picture of the house from that time. It's the headquarters of the Hindustan Gadar Party. And there is photographs of students from that time. Now, what were they doing? They were basically planning to create, to go back and create these networks that would then overthrow the British rule. And so they began to have branches all over, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, back in Europe, in Berlin, and so on. Now, in the middle of all of that, the First World War started. And back in India, I mentioned to you Raj Bihari Bose. He was still around, and he and his lieutenant, Sachindranath Sanyal, they began to coordinate with the Gadarites in North America, and they began to infiltrate the Indian armed forces. And the idea was that they were going to cause a big revolt in the Indian armed forces in February 1915. The basic idea was that just as happened in 1857, there were these mass revolts would happen. The British, caught up as they were with the First World War, would not be able to respond, and then sort of smaller revolts would take place in Indian regiments across the country, across the world, and of course, Indian communities in various parts of the world will also join in that. And in fact, there was such a buzz about this that a significant number of Sikhs from Canada and from California sold everything, took all the dollars they could find, and made their way back to Punjab in ships, where they began to accumulate guns and other things in anticipation of this great revolt. Sadly, what happened is that this revolt did not happen, because just a few days before it was supposed to take off, the British found out about it because a collaborator, an informant, switched sides, informed them about it. All the armories in all the regiments saw their guards being switched from Indian to European, and the revolt basically broke down. So as a result of which, other than in Singapore, where the local Indian regiment did revolt and hold Singapore for a week, most of the regiments did not actually revolt. And so that whole thing broke down. Raj Bihari Bose pretended to be Rabindranath Tagore's cousin, and he escaped to Japan, where he would spend the next several decades. Sachindranath Sanyal would be captured and then be sent off to Kalapani. Many of the others would be captured and also sent to Kalapani or hanged or killed in gunfights, and so on and so forth. But this dream of having a grand revolt in the Indian armed forces, as I mentioned, would remain, and we will come back to it again. Meanwhile, Hardayal, stuck as he was in North America, he began to coordinate with others, such as Raj Bihari Bose, who was in Japan, and also with the Europe-based revolutionaries, who by this point had all gathered in Berlin, and they began to plan to get hold of guns in order to supply these to the India-based revolutionary network, by this point run by another famous revolutionary called Bagha Jatin and his Jugantar group. And the idea was to land some 30,000 rifles on the Orissa coast, where Bagha Jatin would then distribute it to the revolutionary network, and then on Christmas Day 1915, there would be a grand revolt, the Christmas Day plot. But this too failed, because the German agent in Southeast Asia switched sides and informed the British about what was going to happen. The British intercepted these gun shipments, and Bagha Jatin was waiting on Balasore, on the coast of near Balasore in Orissa, waiting for these shipments to come in, but he was apprehended. There was a gunfight, and of course he was killed in that gunfight. So that attempt also failed. Now, many of these characters that I mentioned from the first generation and from the second generation, i.e. the Savarkarite generation and of the second Gadarite generation, they were all shipped off to the Andamans, to the cellular jail there, where they were all kept there. And of course, they were kept in extremely harsh conditions, many of them being literally worked to death on running the oil mill. As you can see over there, there is a picture of an oil press, and many of them would be literally tied to it and made to go round and round in the heat till they basically collapsed from exhaustion. Some of them were tortured in various ways, and many of them tried to commit suicide. Some of them, like Ulhaskar Dutt, were subjected to electric shocks so that they basically went mad. It was very, very horrible. So, the cellular jail for the revolutionaries is a very emotional place, and I visited it a few years ago, and you can see these corridors of cells. That's why it's called the cellular jail. And there is a room dedicated to Savarkar, which you can see. Just a few months ago, another room was dedicated to Sachindranath Sanyal as well. And you can see that's me sitting there on one of the blocks, just outside one of the blocks. And there is a list there of some of the revolutionaries who had to spend time there. You can see the name of Sachin Sanyal, who would be incidentally sent back there in the 1920s as well. He's the only revolutionary or only person to have been sent back to cellular jail twice. So he would stay here and then be sent back again. Now, the Second World War ended, and the soldiers all began to come home. Now, this was, as you can imagine, for the British, a good thing because they had defeated the Germans, but there was another problem that they now faced. that all these regiments, which had been radicalized by the Ghadarites in 1914-15, they were all going back. And remember that these are people who had not only been radicalized and had almost come to revolt, but remember they had also killed white people in Europe during the First World War. So they had, in some ways, lost their fear of white people. They had, they had been at war with the Germans. They had spent time in the trenches with the British troops. So they were veterans. They knew how to use guns, and they had no longer any fear, racial fear of Europeans. They were now all going back home. And there was genuine fear in the British Empire that these soldiers, particularly in Punjab, but also in other parts of the country, would now rise and revolt. So the Ghadar revolt didn't happen during the war, but it would now happen. And this is the context in which these draconian laws called the Rowlatt Acts were put in place. Very often people don't realize that the Rowlatt Acts were a direct response to the revolutionaries. And as a result of these draconian laws, protests began to happen. Of course, the Indian National Congress also participated in these protests. And it all culminated in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Very important, I want to mention here that if you do not know about the Ghadarites and the revolutionaries, then it is not possible to understand the trail of events that led to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. It was not just about the cancellation of a Congress party meeting that led to that. So this is the context. It's very much to do with the revolutionary movement. That is the context. And not only that, 2 decades later, another revolutionary, Udham Singh, would avenge this event, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, by, in London, in an event at Caxton Hall, where he would shoot dead O'Dwyer, the Governor O'Dwyer, who was the governor of Punjab when the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. He killed him because General Dyer had, by this point, died. So he went after the governor of that time, who was equally responsible, and O'Dwyer was Dyer's boss. And he basically killed him in Caxton Hall. Now, it's very important to remember, Caxton Hall is also the place where, incidentally, Savarkar, all those years ago, had stood on a chair and had defended Madan Lal Dhingra. And then Udham Singh would be hanged also in Pentonville prison from the same gallows where Dhingra had been hanged. So if you go to, and then many decades later, in 1973, Udham Singh's ashes would be brought back and is now kept in Jallianwala Bagh Memorial. So if you go to Jallianwala Bagh, it's quite interesting. There is now a very nice pedestrianized path, on one end of which is the Golden Temple, in the middle is Jallianwala Bagh, and then at the other end is the town hall, in front of which there is Madan Lal Dhingra's statue. So you can walk from Madan Lal Dhingra's statue to Jallianwala Bagh Memorial and also see the Kalash in which the ashes of Udham Singh are kept. So I'm telling you all of this so that you understand how linked all of these characters were emotionally as well. Now, the British realized that they had made a major strategic mistake by carrying out the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So, as a kind of a way of trying to sort of gain the initiative, they released a lot of the prisoners from key revolutionary leaders from the cellular jail in 1920. This included Bareen Ghosh and many others, but very importantly included Sachindranath Sanyal. He's particularly important because he came back to India and almost immediately began to look around for recruits for a second attempt, or a third attempt at this point, at a revolution. Now remember, at this point in time, the non-cooperation movement was going on. Many of the revolutionaries, incidentally, had joined Gandhi in this movement. Sachin Sanyal himself was somewhat skeptical about the likelihood of it succeeding, and so he kept himself apart from it. He didn't say anything against it, but he didn't really participate in it. But after the Chauri Chaura incident, when the non-cooperation movement fell apart, he then came forward and began to organize whatever was left of the revolutionaries in North India, but also in Bengal, also in Maharashtra and so on, and began to put all of these groups together. And so, as a result of this, a new organization called the Hindustan Republican Army was set up in 1923. The name is significant because it is named directly after the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. And you have to know that at that time, just like in India, there was a revolutionary movement happening in Ireland, and the Irish were successfully able to use armed resistance as a means to gain freedom. So the Indians were very much inspired by the Irish, and so this name, the Hindustan Republican Army, and on top of it, the Hindustan Republican Association as the political wing. These names are not coincidental. And as a part of that, Sachin Sanyal began to recruit heavily, and many of his recruits would then go on to become very famous revolutionaries. The first generation of recruits that he put together were Ram Prasad Bismil, Rajendra Lahiri, Ashwakulla, and so on. And then there were an even younger group who were university students at that time, which included Chandrasekhar Azad, Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev Thapar, Rajguru, and so on, who would become important even further down. Now, the revolutionaries, of course, had a problem. They didn't have too much arms and ammunition and guns, so they began to use their networks in Germany to try and acquire Mauser pistols, and they managed to get some shipments smuggled through. But of course, they needed money to pay for it. So how do they get money? Because you can't get legal money. So they decided to carry out a robbery of a train which was carrying treasury money at a place just outside Lucknow called Kakodi. And this Kakodi robbery, in which they managed to steal a very large sum of money, happened in 1925, and as a result of which they got a lot of money. But they also came in the radar of the British, who then systematically captured many of the members of the Hindustan Republican Army. And as a result of which, Ashfaqulla, Rajendra Lahiri, and Bismil would be hanged. Sachindranath Sanyal was also captured, and he was sent back to Kalapani, along with many others. His brothers were also accused in it, particularly Bhupendranath Sanyal, and so on. And some of them also saw jail terms as a result of this. So it was a very difficult time for the revolutionaries yet again. So they had just about come back, and they yet again found themselves in, kind of being busted, so to speak. As a result of this, sort of the third generation being kind of of the network being broken down, a very young group of people became the fourth generation of leaders of the revolutionary movement. This is the generation of Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Sukhdev Thapar, Shivram, Rajguru, and so on. And they, in the late 20s, became the group that was organizing themselves. One or two of them were also, by this point in time, experimenting with socialist thought, particularly in the case of Bhagat Singh. And so they, in fact, renamed HRA as HSRA, Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. Now, in the middle of all of this, Lala Lajpat Rai, remember he had been one of the original inspirations of this movement. So he was beaten to death in Lahore in a political rally, and public view, in fact. And as a result of that, the revolutionaries decided that they were going to avenge his death. And so they turned up at a police station and they shot dead a police officer, Saunders. They were actually trying to shoot another police officer, but Saunders happened to be there and they shot him. And of course, Saunders had also been a part of that attack on protesters, so it wasn't entirely out of place. Nevertheless, they shot him dead, and then they escaped. there is an interesting story about how they all escaped in various disguises. I'm not going to get into that, but they effectively ended up dispersed again. Bhagat Singh ended up in Kolkata, and then he slowly made his back to Punjab and Delhi and so on. Now, at this stage, I suppose they should have perhaps thought of taking it easy for a little while, but that was not their nature. They decided that they needed to make a political statement. And so Bhagat Singh and Batukeshwar Dutt decided to go to the Central Assembly, which is now we know as the Parliament, to go there and throw a bomb. The idea was not to hurt anyone. It was merely to make a statement. And so they did that, and they were supposed to court arrest, which they did. And of course, this is a very famous incident, but not many people know that before they went in, they actually went for a picnic, their last meal as free agents, to a Kudsia Park. Those of you who know Delhi know that just outside of ISBT, across the road, there is a Kudsia Park. But ISBT actually used to be a part of this park, and this is what the park looks like today. And so they had a last picnic there, and then they went to the assembly, which is now our current parliament. And then they threw the bomb, they were captured. And then, of course, in the subsequent few weeks, they also captured several of the others. And ultimately, Sukhdev, Thapar, Rajguru, and Bhagat Singh were hanged. They were hanged, and then their bodies were taken to Hussainiwala, where they were cremated very hurriedly in 1931. It is, there is a backstory, there's a later story to it, which is interesting, that at independence, Hussainiwala actually ended up in the wrong side of the border, and the Indian government, because of its emotional link to our revolutionaries, actually exchanged 12 villages to get Hussainiwala. So Hussainiwala is today in the Indian side of the border, and there's a small memorial to them today. Now, Chandrasekhar Azad was now the only senior leader left who was still at large. And in 1931, he was visiting Prayag, then known as Allahabad, and he was cornered in Alfred Park, and where he fought till the last bullet, and then the last bullet he shot himself dead. So with that ended, in a sense, the fourth generation of leadership of the revolutionary movement. There is, however, an interesting side story which I think should be known and is not widely known, is about the betrayal of Chandrasekhar Azad. So the question is, how did the British know that Chandrasekhar Azad was in Prayagraj on that day? There is a lot of course, debate about this, but there is evidence, very strong evidence, that the famous writer Yashpal, who was also a member of the revolutionary movement, was actually an informant, and that he had informed the British. This is something, incidentally, the revolutionaries even at that time suspected, and Azad himself, in fact, had ordered Yashpal to be killed. But nevertheless, it hadn't been carried out, and he had informed the British. But in the 1960s, a CID official, Dharmendra Gaur, found a letter written just before the British were leaving India, in which one British official is telling another British official that, you know, we are about to leave and we have to make arrangements for this very useful informer we have called Yashpal. And so I've put the letter out. I suppose you can't quite see this on the screen, but I have tweeted it as well, and it's available widely on the net. So you can read it, but it's quite a telling letter. Now, the 1930s, after all of this, saw a bunch of other revolts as well. You saw another one happening in Chittagong with the Chittagong arms robbery and so on. But by the mid-30s, the revolutionaries basically had lost steam. And so there's a brief period of, you can call it peace. But by the late 90s, it was very, very clear, late 30s, it was very clear that another war was about to start in Europe in particular, but perhaps even in the Far East. And so as the war drums of the Second World War began to gather place, the revolutionaries began to seek out their old networks once again. Incidentally, by this time, Sachindranath Sanyal had been freed a second time in 1937 from Kala Pani. He was back in India. He was at this time operating out of Lucknow. And he was back in touch with his old comrade who was then in Japan for a long time, Raj Bihari Bose. And they had been in correspondence with each other about what to do about now that yet another opportunity was arising for them to do something like they had attempted in the Gadar. So they began to plan these things when, of course, events turned out in such a way that the senior Congress leader, Subhash Chandra Bose, otherwise popularly known as Netaji, he had been edged out of the Congress. So he was also, and he had, of course, had old links with the revolutionaries for the last decade or so. So all of these characters began to sort of discuss amongst themselves what they could do. And there are, in fact, till very recently living testimonies of Sachindranath Sanyal's son, who would speak of how secret meetings used to be held between the Japanese consul, Netaji, and Sachin Sanyal in their Lucknow home. So, of course, the war started, and famously, I don't have to tell you, Netaji escaped from his house arrest in Kolkata, made his way through Afghanistan, through Soviet Union, to Berlin, where he tried to persuade Hitler to help the cause of armed revolt in the Indian armed forces. He wasn't able really to convince the British, the Germans on this, but he did try, because they were, as I said, there was a small group of Germans who still remembered what had happened in the First World War and did try to help him, but he just couldn't get Hitler to really buy into this idea. But meanwhile, the Japanese had entered the war, and they had captured Singapore, and they had captured large numbers of Indian soldiers as well. And Raj Bihari Bose used that opportunity to try and create an army out of it. So, contrary to popular belief, the Indian National Army, or the Azad Hind Fauj, was founded not by Netaji but by Raj Bihari Bose, the old revolutionary who had attempted to do this in the First World War. Again, reminding you that these are linkages going back right to the beginning. These are not random events happening. But by this point in time, Raj Bihari Bose realized that he was very old, and he was not in good health, and he was not able to kind of give the kind of leadership he needed. So he got the Japanese to request for Netaji to be in Asia. And Netaji, of course, again, very famously, he made his way by submarine to Asia, where he took control of the INA. I don't need to tell you about the subsequent story, of course, that the INA then fought their way through Burma into Manipur and to Nagaland. Netaji, incidentally, was the head of the Indian government, the provisional government of Azad Hind, and he was de jure in charge also of the liberated areas of India, such as the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So he was, in some ways, the first Prime Minister of free India, because he had a government that was recognized by other governments. He was in charge of an army, he issued his own currency, and he was in charge of territory as well, the little bits of India that the Japanese had liberated. This is a photograph, as you can see, of the Azad Hind Fauj march past in the Padang field just in Singapore, just outside their town hall, and there's still a memorial there to them. Of course, the Japanese lost the war, and so naturally the INA was ultimately forced to surrender. They were marched back to India, and they were put on trial in Red Fort. Now, this was again another strategic mistake the British made, because while the war was going on and there was information was kept controlled, most of Indians were not aware of what Netaji and the INA had done. But by putting them on trial, everybody found out about it. And this is a Bauli, incidentally, where some of the officers who had been put on trial had been kept. This is a Bauli in Red Fort, and you can see some of the rooms where some of the officers of the INA were kept during the trials. Many of the soldiers were kept in a small fort next door as well, and in other parts of the country. Now, there's such a sensation happened as a result of this INA trials that the other parts of the army also the grumbling began to grow. And this unhappiness ultimately gathered enough pace that in 1946, the Royal Indian Navy opened up in open revolt. Some 20,000 naval soldiers, veterans by the way, took control of Mumbai and the harbor and of something like 80 odd ships. And they basically raised the flag of freedom and pulled down the British flag. Similar kinds of revolts happened in Karachi port, in Kolkata and other places. When the Royal Indian Air Force was asked to bomb them, they refused. There were clearly grumblings happening also in the Indian Army. And it is at this stage that the British realized that they could no longer control India. You can see Hindustan Standard of that day, Indian sailors in revolt. So this was a very major event. Again, very often left completely out of our history books because it doesn't fit the narrative that that we somehow became free because we were making salt on a beach in Gujarat. So this is a different story. I'm not saying that this is the only story, but it is important to remember that it was during this revolt that the Cabinet Commission on India's freedom was set up. So this did have something to do with it, surely. And as a result of which, a year later, India became free in August of 1947. Now, all these events, incidentally, are not events that ended just there. They had major consequences. Now, remember that which were the three provinces which had been at the forefront of this revolutionary movement. Of course, all provinces had contributed, but three provinces stood out: Bengal, Punjab, and Maharashtra. It is not entirely a coincidence then that both Punjab and Bengal were partitioned as punishment for what they had done. The third province also was given another kind of punishment. Remember, the community that was at the forefront of many of these revolutionary activities was the Maharashtrian Brahmin community. And the British had been very scared of them right from the beginning because they were always afraid that that this group wanted to re-establish the pre-British Maratha Empire. So what they did is they invested very heavily over decades in anti-Brahmin propaganda. And this had a horrific impact on this community, because a member of this community, as it happens to be, assassinated Gandhi, Godse, as you know, Nathuram Godse. But immediately after that assassination, large numbers of people came onto the streets and they began to riot. And in those riots, which is not very different from the 1984 anti-Sikh riots that happened in many decades later, a large number of people, perhaps hundreds of people, were beaten to death, burned to death. Thousands of houses were burnt. And it was quite a horrific event. I'm mentioning this because if you read newspapers from that time, you will be amazed how little is actually written about this. And of course, history books have completely forgotten about this. But if you listen to the oral histories of this community from that time, and you will find some pretty horrible oral histories from that time. I want to mention this because, again, as I said, the history of the revolutionaries did not end in 1947. There are many later things that happened to them. I mentioned partition. I mentioned the riots against the Maharashtrian Brahmins. But there were other things that have happened much, much later. For example, remember the Gadarites? Well, a lot of them were Sikhs. And the British were very keen on trying to get the Sikh community to break away from the nationalists. So they infiltrated the Gurudwaras, particularly in Canada, and they deliberately began to fund those who were particularly, loyal to the British, of course, but also had these radically anti-Hindu views, because what they were trying to do, remember, is separate out the Hindus from the Sikhs. So they began to fund what we now would call the Khalistani movement. And so this is, if those of you who have sometimes find it very surprising, why is it that Canada is the hub of the Khalistani movement? Well, it has everything to do with the First World War, the attempt by the Ghadarites Sikhs to foment trouble against the British Empire, and what the British then did by infiltrating the Gurudwaras and funding these radical elements over that. So, and that has then subsequently led to the Khalistani movement in the 1980s. Again, I'm giving you a sense of how these things play themselves out. Yet another example from Bengal. In Bengal, many of these movements, revolutionary movements, were done, had sort of their base in East Bengal, particularly among the Hindu community of East Bengal. Now, of course, after partition, this Hindu community ended up in ended up in the wrong side of the border. Many of them, over the next decade, slowly made their way into India. Now, the revolutionary movement, the original Anushilan Samiti had, of course, died out and splintered and so on. But whatever little was left of it was organized into a political party, later on called the Revolutionary Socialist Party, after independence, RSP. Again, many people may not have even heard of this small party today. But the Revolutionary Socialist Party was an important organizing principle amongst these revolutionary-linked people. And they continued to be quite important in East Bengal. And after 1970-71 war, when there was a major genocide of Hindus in East Pakistan, many of them ended up in West Bengal. And what happened is that they then began to organize themselves in West Bengal as a political group. The communists in 1977 had just come to power, and they saw the RSP, who ironically were their allies in the government, they saw the RSP as a threat. And when a group of these refugees settled in an island called Morijhapi, just outside of the Sundarbans, Jyoti Basu actually got it surrounded by the police and literally starved that place of any water and food. And as a result of that, nobody knows exactly how many, but thousands of people, men, women, young children, died of hunger and thirst on that island. This is the Morijhapi massacre. It's the worst act of state-sponsored terrorism against the citizens that happened in post-independence India. Horrific event, again, completely deleted out of our national narrative, but it had everything to do, again, to the history of the revolutionaries. So as you can see, the revolutionary movement was not merely edited out of Indian history, it was deliberately subverted, not just by the British, by those also who came to power subsequently, by editing them out of the history books, but also in many ways actively suppressing many of their movements and networks after independence. I hope I gave you a sense of what this movement was about, how this was a long, drawn movement over decades. Many of the characters, as you can see, they keep coming back. They are not characters that happened once in a flash in the pan. Aurobindo Ghosh and Savarkar provided a template that was used for many decades. The likes of Sachin Sanyal, Raj Bihari keep coming back in the story and trying to do the same thing over and over again. And of course, in the end, they succeeded. They had tried over all those decades to cause a revolt in the Indian armed forces. Well, with the revolt in the Royal Indian Navy, they finally succeeded. And of course, it led directly to India becoming free. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.